Okay, so this is video 14 to go with the production system and the nitrogen cycle notes. Unsurprisingly, the second part is going to be on the nitrogen cycle. So, what do we actually mean by nitrogen then, when it comes to the nitrogen cycle? Well, nitrogen is a gas that's found naturally floating around in the air. Two little nitrogen atoms joined together. The picture on your left you can see is liquid nitrogen, which is the only way you can visibly see it. But nitrogen gas is naturally found in the air. However, in the nitrogen cycle, that nitrogen is found in lots of different types of compounds and molecules. In organisms, plants, fungi, animals, bacteria, protista, it's found in amino acids, in a part called the amine group. Amino acids are what makes up proteins found in muscle, making enzymes, hormones, and it's also found as part of DNA, the coding molecule that's found in every single cell of your body that tells the body how to make the characteristics and so on. Nitrogen is also found in the soil in different forms. A nitrogen joined to 3 oxygen creates a compound called nitrates. Nitrates are very important because that's how plants get their nitrogen. You also find them as nitrites, which is an oxygen joined to a nitrogen joined to 2 oxygen, and then as ammonia, a nitrogen joined to 3 hydrogens. And all of these 3 compounds will play important roles in the nitrogen cycle when the forms of nitrogen that are formed and found in soil. So briefly about a food chain and its importance to the nitrogen cycle. A food chain shows a series of organisms that feed off each other. The plant that starts off this food chain is generally known as the producer, although it doesn't have to be a plant. But it's the organism that obtains energy for the food chain. It'll be eaten by a primary consumer, in this case a locust, then by the secondary consumer and tertiary consumer, and so on. Now, a food chain is normally used to illustrate the passage of energy between organisms. But just as they're eating each other to obtain energy, they're also obtaining their nitrogen from the source below. Plants or producers would be the only exception to this, where they absorb their nitrogen instead. So the amino acids that are in one of these organisms and the DNA will be passed on to the next organism down the food chain. The locust will digest the proteins of the producer and get its amino acids. The lizard will digest the DNA of the locust and use it to make its own DNA. So that nitrogen, the nitrogen of those molecules, is being passed down the food chain or up the food chain. However, nitrogen also leaves the food chain. Those amino acids in DNA might leave in different forms. For example, if one of those organisms dies, unless there's some sort of scavenger, they won't be eaten in the food chain. Excretion, the removal of waste products such as urea when we urinate, some of those contain nitrogen. The urea in urine contains nitrogen. It's a form of excretion where the nitrogen leaves the food chain. And then defecation, the removal of feces, that often contains or always contains nitrogen because of what you ate is coming out. Some of it is coming out the back end, and you would have eaten nitrogen in that food. So going back to plants then, how does it get back into the plants once it's left the food chain? Well, this is all to do with bacteria in the soil. Special organisms called decomposers, which aren't necessarily bacteria, those decomposers will convert the DNA molecules and amino acids into the ammonia. And then bacteria will convert it and change it into nitrites. And finally, they'll finish the job and change it into nitrates. So you can see here that how important these compounds in the soil we mentioned, the bacteria, are, because without it, the ammonia wouldn't be changed into nitrates, and won't re-enter the plants because nitrates, as I said, is the form of nitrogen that plants reabsorb it. So now we've got a constant cycle, the nitrogen passing up the food chain, leaving it at different points through death, decomposition, and death, excretion and defecation, and then being converted back to nitrates so the plants can absorb it. So this is then, summing it up, this is the nitrogen cycle. An example here of the fish, which is passing out its waste products, the being converted into ammonia, to nitrites, to nitrates, to be used by plants, and then eventually the fish will eat the plants. And it's this constant cycle of different forms of nitrogen. Now, as well as being altered within in this pathway that returns the nitrogen to the food chain, it also might be changed into nitrogen gas. So the nitrate might be changed into gas and released into air, or it might be returned, the gas might be returned to the nitrogen cycle, whereas we can see here the nitrogen gas would be turned into ammonia. So those are very important parts of the cycle. If the nitrogen gas wasn't turned back into ammonia, then we'd gradually lose all our nitrogen nutrients to the air. But also then we've got the bacteria that play essential roles. There's different names to the bacteria. As I've already mentioned, there's the decomposer bacteria, but there are others. Converting the nitrogen gas to ammonia, you've got nitrogen fixing. Think of it fixing hydrogen to nitrogen to create ammonia. The nitrifying bacteria then work to convert the ammonia to nitrites and the nitrites to nitrates. And then we'll often consider the bad bacteria, or the denitrifying bacteria, that will convert nitrates to nitrogen gas. Obviously in gardening and agriculture, when we're making plants, we want fewer of the denitrifying bacteria to keep nitrates in the soil for the plants, and that will promote growth. We want more the nitrogen fixing bacteria. So how can we go about altering the nitrogen cycle to make it better for our plants? Well, firstly, plough in. Nitrogen fixing bacteria love oxygen. They need what we call aerobic conditions. So ploughing and breaking up the soil makes sure oxygen gets to them, and so it promotes the nitrogen fixing bacteria. We get more ammonia, and that will eventually lead to more nitrates for the plants. Drainage. The same reason. When water is saturated, it's more difficult for oxygen to get to the soil level, so it promotes nitrogen fixing bacteria. Also, it should be noted that denitrifying bacteria, the bad ones that convert nitrates to gas and therefore the nitrates are no longer available to plants, they like anaerobic conditions, the total opposite. They like the absence of oxygen. So when you've got compact soil or when you've got saturated soil, it's not just bad because you haven't got the nitrogen fixing bacteria, but it's bad because you've got the denitrifying bacteria, which are getting rid of the nitrates from your soil. There's other ways as well. We can use fertilizers. A lot of fertilizers contain nitrates and therefore add the nitrogen to the soil. And there's a special type of plant called a legume, which contains its own nitrogen fixing bacteria inside its roots. So when you plant legumes, they actually bring nitrogen to the soil. The last one is important in the last part of the cycle, which is crop rotation. In crop rotation, there are different systems in which we go through planting one type of plant one year, and then on the same area, a new type of plant. Not just any plant now, we do it through a cycle of particular varieties of plant. Now, the reason why we do this are different families of plants have different pests, so you're helping to the next year's crops are less likely to suffer from the pests of the previous plants. And also as well, the order in which we plant the plants over the years changes the quality and the structure of the soil which certain plants prefer. So as I said, the first one is legumes. These are peas, beans, lentils, even clover, but we wouldn't tend to in the vegetable garden plant clover. But these bring nitrogen into the soil. So they make a very rich nitrogen-based soil. So next year then, when we plant what we call brassicas, those are broccoli, cabbages, sprouts, they're green leafy vegetables which need a lot of nitrogen. But now the soil is rich in nitrogen thanks to the legumes last year. And then a final type to rotate in the third year is the root crops. Now root crops you have to be careful with. If the soil is too rich in nitrogen, then the leafy parts of the root crops, the bit we don't eat as much, that will tend to grow thoroughly. So with the root crops, we really want the less nitrogen. Of course, in this rotation system, the brassicas have used a lot of that nitrogen. So this is 2 years after the applying of the legumes. So the root crops, they'll tend to put the work into their roots rather than into the leafy structures. This is just one example of crop rotation, and there are other examples, but this is the classic gardener's method. So that's the nitrogen cycle and the last part of the production system and nitrogen notes.